They told Silas Boone he was a fool for buying that rotting cabin on Widow's Ridge, especially for a quarter. Folks said it was cursed, hollow, cursed and hollow. But Silas wasn't scared of bad timber or ghost stories. He just wanted peace. Far from the war and the debts and the dying. But the first night he stayed, the floorboards beneath his bed groaned like something was breathing. By morning, he found the padlocked trapdoor under the rug steel welded shut, with burn marks along the edges and a warning carved deep. Do not open or it comes back. That's when Silas realized. The price wasn't a bargain. It was a warning. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Silas rode into Ash Hollow at dusk, the last light of the day spilling over the plains in strokes of red and gold, and the townsfolk watched him from doorways and behind curtains, their silence heavy with suspicion, as though the dust on his coat carried more than just the miles, carried the weight of a man who had seen too much and survived anyway, a former Union scout. His face was a map of scars, both visible and unseen, one white seam running from his temple to his jaw where a Confederate blade had tried to finish him, another hidden deeper in his chest where memory clawed at him still, and though he had made it through the war, he had not escaped it. For every night the dead returned to him in dreams, whispering questions he never answered. Silas kept his distance from people, speaking only when necessity demanded, for experience had taught him that silence was safer than confession, and logic steadier than the fickle currents of belief. Yet his arrival in Ash Hollow stirred whispers almost immediately, especially when he laid down gold for a piece of land most folks wouldn't ride past after sundown, the shack known as the Devil's Cabin, a weathered structure, standing half-hidden in the cottonwoods at the edge of town, its roof sagging, its windows blind with grime, a place that carried stories darker than its timbers, tales of the family found dead there a decade past, of strange fires that lit its chimney though no one lived within, of screams said to echo from its rafters when the wind rose right. The townsfolk crossed themselves when Silas signed the deed, the mayor himself storming into the saloon where the papers were exchanged, slamming his palm down on the counter and calling the purchase an insult to memory, his jowls quivering with outrage as he warned that no good man, no sane man, would take residence in that cursed place. But Silas, leaning back in his chair with his whiskey untouched, only laughed a dry, rasping chuckle that made the mayor's face purple with fury, for to him, a cabin was timber and nails, soil was soil, and curses were nothing more than stories clung to by people too weak to face the randomness of the world. And he said as much, his voice flat as a whetstone as he told them ghosts didn't kill men, bullets did. Disease did. Hunger did. And if a shack in the woods frightened them, it was because they let their own shadows spook them. The saloon fell into a hush at his words, the kind of silence that carried both fear and offense. And from that moment, Ash Hollow marked him not just as a stranger but as an intruder. A man who had come to live among them but not with them. A man who mocked their warnings and carried a past they didn't trust. Yet Silas paid it no mind, riding out the next morning with supplies for his new home, the cabin looming like a dare in the early light. And though his logic held firm, a prickle worked its way down his scarred jaw as he approached the sagging porch, as if the place itself had been waiting all these years for someone fool enough to laugh at the stories and step inside. The first night in the Devil's Cabin, Silas lay on the narrow cot he'd dragged into the corner, his rifle propped within reach and the lantern guttering low, the silence of the woods pressing tight against the walls. And though he told himself the place was nothing more than rotten timber and superstition, he could not ignore the faint sound that came after midnight, the dry, insistent scrape of something against wood, like claws dragging slow along the planks, followed by a low, uneven breath that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. He sat up, heart pounding though his face remained still, hand tight around the rifle stock as he listened. But when the noise faded, he cursed himself for a fool, chalking it to rats or the creak of an old structure settling against the night air, and lay back down, determined not to let ghosts into his head. Yet the second night brought the sound again, louder this time, the scratching joined by something more unnerving, a whisper too faint to make out, like words spoken through water, curling up from the trapdoor set in the middle of the room, its iron ring rusted but visible in the lantern's weak glow. And though Silas rose and yanked the door up, expecting to startle some vermin, the dark hole beneath gaped empty. Nothing but the cool draft of earth meeting him, no movement, no eyes, no thing he could put a bullet through. And he slammed it shut with a mutter, forcing himself back to bed though his skin prickled as though unseen fingers traced along his spine. By the third night, his exhaustion had soured into anger, and when the scratching came again, ragged, insistent, like nails desperate to get out, he ignored it, rolling to face the wall and muttering about wind and mice. But at dawn, when he stepped outside to tend his horse, he found the animal sprawled in the grass, its hide raked with deep gashes, eyes wide in terror, as though it had fought against something unseen until its heart gave out, the stench of blood rising thick in the morning air, and Silas knelt beside the carcass, jaw tight, his scout's eye tracing the marks and finding them too broad for a coyote, too deliberate for accident. Yet even as his gut twisted with unease, he muttered aloud that it was some wildcat, nothing more, clinging to reason as fiercely as he gripped the shovel he used to bury the beast. Though each scrape of the spade into soil echoed the sound he had heard in the cabin, scratching, scratching, as though mocking his insistence that the world made sense, and though he set his shoulders firm and returned inside, he could not shake the thought that something waited beneath that trapdoor, patient and hungry, and that in laughing off the warnings of Ash Hollow, he might have laid his bed on top of its den. The morning after burying his horse, Silas rode into town on foot, leading the empty bridle like a banner of stubborn defiance, and though the townsfolk stared at him with something between pity and satisfaction, none dared speak until a trembling voice called him over from a rocking chair on the boarding house porch. Old Widow Hannigan, wrapped in shawls despite the heat, her face a network of lines carved by time and grief, her cloudy eyes sharp as needles when they fixed on him. She was the last living soul who remembered the cabin's first curse, and though Silas had little patience for ghost stories, something in her gaze rooted him still, so he leaned against the post and listened as she rasped out a tale he could not dismiss as easily as barroom gossip. Men had gone missing there long before the war, she said. Men who wandered in bold as him and were never seen again. Not one, her own husband among them, gone on a night he'd sworn to claim the land for farming. His boots left on the porch as though he had stepped out of them in a hurry, never to return. Another man, young and drunk, had once pried open the trapdoor in a fit of bravado, and what came out of that black hole was no animal, no ghost, but something that kept him screaming for 3 days straight, his voice carrying through the walls while the townsfolk gathered outside too afraid to go in, until one night the screaming stopped, and when they finally dared to enter, he was gone. No trace but the smell of iron and earth thick in the air, and the trapdoor shut tight as though it had never been touched. Silas scoffed, muttering that people see what they want to see. But the widow's hand shot out quick as a striking snake, gripping his wrist with surprising strength, her nails biting through his sleeve as she hissed, "It ain't what's under the cabin. Boy, it's what the cabin sits on." Her breath sour but her words hot enough to sear into his bones. And when he jerked free, shaken despite himself, she sank back into her chair, muttering prayers too old for scripture while rocking slow, her eyes never leaving him as he turned to leave. Silas strode away with his jaw clenched, telling himself she was a relic of madness, her warnings nothing but the echoes of grief that had twisted her mind. Yet her words clung to him like burrs all the long walk back. And when he reached the clearing where the devil's cabin hunched in its crooked shadow, he found himself staring not at the trapdoor within but at the ground beneath the porch, the way the soil dipped slightly, dark and damp as though it had drunk too much blood. And for the first time since he bought the place, Silas felt the uneasy stirrings of doubt, small, unwelcome, but alive, whispering that perhaps it was not the cabin's walls that held the danger, but the earth itself, and that by laying his claim here, he had tethered himself to something vast, old, and hungry. For 3 nights Silas stared at the trapdoor like a man locked in a duel, the iron ring rusted to the boards, its seams sealed shut with some long-ago weld that mocked his every attempt to treat the place like any other cabin. And by the 4th night, his logic, always the sharpest weapon in his arsenal, twisted into obsession, telling him that the only way to banish fear was to confront it, to drag whatever secrets lay beneath into the light of day. So he built a fire in the hearth until the coals glowed white, heating an old iron poker red-hot, and with the methodical patience of a scout trained to dismantle enemy traps, he pressed and hammered until the brittle welds hissed and split, the room filling with the acrid tang of scorched metal, his shirt soaked through with sweat though the night outside lay cool. When at last the hinges gave with a groan, the trapdoor yawned open, exhaling a gust of air so foul and heavy with sulfur that it stung his eyes and clung in his throat like smoke, yet Silas gritted his teeth, set a lantern to flame, and leaned the light over the opening, revealing a ladder descending into blackness, the rungs slick with damp and disappearing into depths his lantern could not pierce. Every sensible part of him urged retreat, but another voice, the same voice that had led him through enemy lines and kept him alive when others fell, whispered that knowledge meant survival. So he lowered himself step by step, the wood creaking beneath his boots, the air growing colder, thicker, until he reached the midway point and froze. For out of the depths rose a sound that made the marrow in his bones shiver. His own name, whispered low, stretched thin, spoken not by any tongue of flesh but by something that had studied his voice and returned, it broken, the syllables curling up the shaft like smoke from a dying fire. Panic swelled, cold and absolute, and Silas, who had stared down cannon fire and the shrieks of dying men, felt his body betray him, his hands scrabbling for the rungs above as he hauled himself upward, lantern swinging wild, heart hammering as the whispers grew, repeating his name with rising hunger, until at last he tumbled out onto the floorboards, slamming the trapdoor shut with all his weight only to find it stuck half open, the hinges locked as though the wood itself resisted, the sulfur air pouring into the cabin in steady waves, carrying with it faint scratches, faint breaths, the steady pulse of something waiting just below. Silas threw his shoulder against the door, jammed a chair atop it, braced it with his rifle and whatever weight he could muster. But still the crack gaped wide enough for the dark to peer through, and for the first time since buying the Devil's Cabin, his laugh, the laugh that had once mocked the townsfolk's warnings, died in his throat, leaving only silence and the echo of his own name still whispering from the black. The following day, Silas moved through the cabin like a man possessed, searching not for comfort but for explanation, every creak in the walls, every draft through the floorboards feeding his determination to uncover the truth of what he had loosed. And it was behind a loose plank near the hearth that his fingers brushed against something dry and hidden, a hollow in the wall where dust lay thick as ash, and, within it, a leather-bound book mottled with age, its cover warped but still intact, smelling of mildew and smoke. He carried it to the table and opened it with the caution of a soldier checking a trap, finding page after page scrawled in a hand that began steady and scriptural, but grew jagged, fevered, until words sprawled across margins like wounds, and the name at the front, Ezekiel Thorne, once preacher of Ash Hollow, rang familiar, whispered in the town's history as a man who had led services until vanishing into disgrace. The early pages spoke of sermons, of faith, of a community in need of light, but soon the entries darkened, describing nights when things moved beneath the ground, as though worms the size of oxen sought to crawl free, and how prayers failed to banish the sounds that seeped up from beneath the foundation of the cabin he had built as a retreat. Thorne wrote of discovering symbols older than Scripture carved in stones found under the soil, stones that sweated when touched, and how he turned from Bible to forbidden texts scavenged from travelers and peddlers, piecing together rites not to summon, but to bind. For he had come to believe that the cabin itself must serve as a cage, a prison hammered from wood and faith to hold back what crawled up from the rock. The later pages named it in strokes so forceful the ink had bled through. The hollow god. A thing not worshipped but warded, not adored but contained, something that sought the warmth of men's voices to climb upward, a hunger that could wear their faces if unbound. The journal described rituals performed in secrecy, blood spilled upon the trapdoor to keep it locked, fire burned in the hearth as offering coins left upon the quarter beam to serve as payment for the warden, a cryptic line Silas puzzled over until he read further. Realizing that each man who took the cabin agreed to stand guard, to keep the binding whole, their coin laid down not as fee for land but as tithe for duty, and those who shirked or failed were consumed, their screams echoing for days as the hollow god tested the bars of its prison. Silas read until his eyes burned, until his scars itched with the memory of war, and though his logic fought every word, He could not dismiss the clarity with which Thorne described the rituals. The ink spattered with something that looked too much like blood, the final entry ending in a jagged hand. The cage weakens. Without a keeper, it will rise. Better a man's soul than the world's flesh. Closing the book, Silas sat in silence, the trapdoor's sulfur breath creeping through the crack. And for the first time he wondered if his coming here had been no accident of chance, but the fulfillment of a debt written long before his name was ever spoken in Ash Hollow. The storm rolled in from the west without warning, a wall of black thunderheads towering higher than the ridge, the sky split by spears of lightning that lit the prairie in stark flashes. And though storms were not uncommon in Ash Hollow, this one carried a violence that felt pointed, as if drawn toward a single mark, and that mark was the devil's cabin. Silas had been reading the preacher's journal again by lamplight, the words scrawled there circling in his mind like vultures, when the first bolt struck the ridge with a crack that rattled the glass panes, and before he could rise to check the shutters, another seared the very roof beam above him, the thunder so close it knocked him to his knees, ears ringing, the lantern flaring out, plunging him into a darkness broken only by the glow from beneath the floor. For the trapdoor had burst open on its own, the chair and rifle he'd braced against it thrown aside as though by unseen hands, and from its gaping mouth poured not the sulfur stench alone but a rolling exhalation of heat and shadow, a wind that smelled of graves long shut and stone long buried, and Silas staggered back, rifle raised, though he knew instinctively that bullets would serve him no more than prayers. Outside, the storm raged, lightning striking the chimney again and again until sparks rained down the hearth though no fire burned there. And in town, a mile off, the people of Ash Hollow stood in their doorways and stared toward the ridge, whispering as black smoke coiled up from the cabin's chimney, thick and oily, writhing like a living thing against the sky. Though no flame fed it, no wood was burning, only the breath of something old escaping after too many years confined. Silas felt the floor tremble beneath his boots, each vibration carrying up through his bones, and from the pit rose a sound more dreadful than the storm itself. The slow, deliberate pull of breath too vast to belong to any man, followed by a chorus of whispers that braided together into a single hunger, a murmur that pressed against his mind like claws, urging him to come closer, to look, to descend, promising relief from scars, from memory, from grief if he only let go. He clutched the journal like a shield, shouting curses into the gale, though his voice was swallowed by thunder and the laughter that now seemed to curl beneath it, not human, not sane, but rising, always rising. And as he shoved the trapdoor shut with the weight of his body, bracing it with every ounce of strength left in him, he felt for the first time the truth of Widow Hannigan's words. It wasn't what was under the cabin, it was what the cabin sat on, and now the storm had struck the lock, and something older than the town, older than his war, was stretching awake, hungry for the world above. By dawn the storm had passed, but the world it left behind was not the same. Animals shrieked in terror, as if some scent too old and primal had woken in their nostrils, horses frothing at their reins, dogs howling and snapping at shadows, cattle breaking fences to flee toward the barren ridge. And when Silas staggered into Ash Hollow with the preacher's journal clutched to his chest and his rifle uselessly slung across his back, he found the town a hollow echo of itself. Several houses stood wide open, doors torn from hinges not by storm wind but by force deliberate and cruel, chairs overturned, meals left half-eaten, and no souls within, as though the inhabitants had risen mid-breath and been plucked into the dark. Those few he did find were broken remnants of people he had seen just days before. Mrs. Keating, who sold him nails at the general store, now sat rocking on her stoop, eyes wide and vacant, mumbling that she could hear her dead son calling her from the well, while two boys clawed at each other in the dust, shrieking accusations of theft over coins neither held. The worst sight met him at the old chapel, where the preacher's widow, once a quiet, dignified woman with hair always pinned, now staggered barefoot in her nightgown, clawing at her own arms until blood streaked them, muttering hymns spliced with howls of laughter, her voice snapping from hymnals to curses in the same breath, while above her, swaying from the bell rope itself, hung the mayor, his jowls slack, tongue protruding, his hat fallen at his feet like a mockery of office, the note pinned to his vest, Nothing but scrawled words. It whispers what I am. Silas, hardened by battlefields and corpses, felt his gut seize as he realized that what had poured out of the cabin was no mere beast, but something that fed not on flesh alone, but on memory, on guilt, on fear, the very marrow of human weakness, and with each life it touched, it left either madness or absence, as though swallowing the soul whole. He staggered through the empty streets, calling names, but each echo only deepened the silence, and the journal's words returned to him with dreadful clarity. The hollow god feeds upon remembrance. Each thought of it is a chain broken. Each fear of it is a gate swung wide. It was rising, stretching invisible tendrils through the town, hollowing men and women alike until Ash Hollow itself became its feast. And Silas knew with a cold certainty that unless he acted, the fate of this place would spread outward like fire on prairie grass, devouring not just Ash Hollow but every settlement that dared remember its name. Silas knew there was no wall high enough nor rifle sharp enough to stand between Ash Hollow and what had slipped its cage, and so, with the preacher's journal wrapped tight in oilcloth and slung across his back like scripture for a damned congregation, he returned to the cabin as twilight bled over the ridge, the air already thick with sulfur and whispers, each step across the threshold like walking deeper into a grave. The trapdoor gaped wide now, its iron hinges split clean by the storm's fury, and though every scar in his body screamed that he had stared into enough darkness for one life, Silas set the lantern alight, tightened his belt, and lowered himself rung by rung into the pit below, the journal's words steadying his breath as much as the steel in his hand. The ladder seemed endless, the air thickening with every descent, until at last his boots struck stone, not soil, and the world opened into a labyrinth of chambers carved not by men but by time older than language. Walls glistening with veins of black mineral that pulsed faintly as though alive. The floor littered with bones gnawed smooth, human and animal jumbled alike, and through the tunnels drifted whispers that bent themselves into words he thought long buried his captain's orders at Shiloh, his wife's dying gasp, the taunts of men he'd killed in ambush all woven together until he nearly dropped the lantern for pressing his palms to his ears. Deeper still, he found signs of those who had come before him. A soldier's blue coat, shredded and stiff with age, a miner's pick sunk into stone where the handle had rotted away, and worse, the living remnants, men and women hollow-eyed, their skin gray and stretched, crouched in corners of the maze, still breathing but twisted, muttering to themselves in voices not their own, some whispering their names over and over, others croaking hymns warped into blasphemy, their gazes turning toward him with hunger that was not human but borrowed, as though the hollow god spoke through their wasted throats. One reached for him, nails cracked to the quick, begging in a voice that split between plea and command. "Stay with us, feed it with us." And Silas, heart hammering, raised his rifle though he could not bring himself to fire, only backing away, lantern shaking, journal whispering its instructions in his memory, blood on the stones, fire in the center, the warden's price laid down to lock the gate. He pressed on, the tunnel sloping deeper, the air growing so thick with sulfur that each breath felt like swallowing ash, and all the while the shadows lengthened, taking shapes men he'd known, women he'd lost, faces that should have been buried but now stepped from the dark to greet him with hollow smiles, until at last he reached a vast chamber where the stone itself trembled, and he knew he had come to the heart, the very belly of what the cabin had been built to bind. And though terror gnawed at his bones, Silas clenched the journal to his chest and whispered aloud that he had come not to join but to end. The chamber at the pit's heart was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, the stone under Silas's boots trembling with a pulse that felt too steady, too deliberate, like the heartbeat of the world itself. And as he stepped into the circle of broken bones that marked its center, the lantern flame guttered low, yet the dark needed no light for it was alive, folding and unfurling around him in shapes that hinted at faces, bodies, memories, all stitched together from smoke and hunger. Then it spoke, not in thunder but in the soft cadence of voices Silas knew too well. His wife's laughter, his captain's praise, the dying moans of soldiers he had cut down in ambush, all braided into a single tone that slid straight into his marrow, calling him by name, promising him a life scrubbed clean of scars and grief, a peace without whiskey to drown it, without nightmares to choke it, without the endless ache of failure that had driven him here. The hollow god whispered of power too, the ability to stride above men, to command fear itself, to bend memory as easily as fire bends dry grass, and for one terrible moment, Silas felt the temptation settle into him, heavy and sweet, like a bullet meant to be bitten down on, a release from everything he had carried since the war. Yet he had lived long enough to know that such bargains came at a cost greater than flesh. And as the air pressed against his lungs and the shapes of those he had lost beckoned him forward, he dropped the journal to the ground and pulled from his satchel the crude sticks of dynamite he had salvaged from the old mining stores in town, his hands steady now, his mind clear with the resolve of a man who had nothing left but choice. The hollow god hissed as he struck the match, its whispers twisting sharp, trying to turn his resolve into ash. "You are nothing without your pain. You are nothing without me." But Silas only laughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed like defiance, and jammed the fuse into the bundle, the spark spitting light that threw the chamber into wild relief. Bones gleaming, shadows rearing like beasts, the stone groaning as though it already knew what was coming. He staggered to the ladder's base, no time to climb, no desire to run. And as the hollow god's voice rose to a shriek, promising eternity, promising salvation, Silas shouted back the only truth he had left. "Better me than the world," before hurling himself atop the charges, his body the weight that would ensure the seal, and in the final heartbeat before the blast, he thought not of war, not of scars, but of silence, true silence. And then the chamber roared, stone collapsing, fire and smoke swallowing everything, the tunnels caving in as if the earth itself clenched its fist, burying the hollow god, burying Silas, and sealing the prison once more in blood and sacrifice. Weeks slipped by like sand through a cracked glass, and Ash Hollow staggered forward in uneasy silence, its streets emptier, its people quieter. The memory of the storm and the screams stitched into their days, though no one spoke of it outright, for silence was safer than remembrance, and remembrance was what fed the thing they all prayed was gone. Then one dusty afternoon, a stranger rode into town, not unlike Silas had months before, his hat pulled low, his smile too easy, his boots too clean for the roads he claimed to have traveled, and he leaned at the bar with the kind of charm that made folk uneasy, asking casual questions about land for sale, about cabins standing empty, about ridges where a man might claim solitude and quiet. And though the barkeep poured his whiskey, he said nothing, only wiping the counter slower than usual, his hand trembling when the drifter pressed, saying he'd heard of a place on the ridge, an old cabin some called cursed, some called haunted, the sort of place a man with no ties might make his own. The barkeep's eyes darted to the silver coin the drifter rolled idly between his fingers, the glint of it catching the dim light, and when the stranger flipped it onto the counter with a careless smile, it landed with a ring too sharp, too final, a silver quarter staring up from the wood, the same coin Widow Hannigan once swore was payment for the warden, and the barkeep froze, rag dropping from his hand, his mouth going dry as though he'd been struck dumb. The drifter tipped his hat, collected his whiskey, and walked out without another word, the quarter still spinning faintly on the wood, and the barkeep, too shaken to pocket it, too afraid to touch it, let it rest until it stilled, the room silent, but for the creak of floorboards. Outside, the stranger's horse carried him slow toward the ridge, and as the sun sank low, the camera of the world seemed to follow, lingering on the cabin standing crooked but unbroken, its timbers scorched by lightning, its windows blind but unshattered, the chimney cold though townsfolk swore they sometimes saw smoke curl from it at dusk, and inside, the trapdoor lay sealed, the iron ring buried under splintered boards, silent, unmoving, yet the air seemed to pulse faintly, like breath caught between slumber and waking, as if the earth itself waited for the next fool with scars enough, grief enough, or hunger enough to answer the call. The wind rattled the shutters, dust swirling like whispers along the porch, and though nothing stirred in the darkness below, the silence was not peace but pause, a warning written into the bones of the land, that prisons made by men never hold forever, and that the cabin remained its duty unbroken, its curse unended, its watch resumed, for now.